this week I was supposed to be hosting the Kenyans, the circle organized by women, but we are still in the heat of Black Lives Matter. And this is a story that we really have to keep coming back to, because as you all know, this story is not going away very soon. There are so many things happening. There's so many changes happening around the world, around the US. And one of the reasons why I convened this meeting with these three gentlemen, professionals in their field, is because they've studied this historical aspects of this issue. And today we want to really focus on the role of Africa, African leaders, and African diaspora in the debate that is going on around Black Lives Matter, and in general, what we call the lives of the Black person in the diaspora. So it's my pleasure to host again, one more time, Professor Jeremiah Okari. Okari is joining us from Minneapolis, and it's also my pleasure to host again on our show, Professor Shadrach Wanjala Nasongo. He's joining us from Mississippi, and for the first time on our show, it's my pleasure to host Professor Tiso. Professor Kefos Tiso is a professor based in Ohio, in what we call, Professor, what's the name of the school, the college?
Bowling Green State University.
Bowling Green University. So what this gentleman, their role here today is to make us look a little smarter in terms of understanding the issues that are going on around the Black Lives Matter, and in general, just what's happening to the diaspora. I remember, I think it's Professor Okari Professor Tiso, who told me that beyond the US, in fact, Brazil hosts the largest number of the Black diaspora. We are going to confirm that today. It was still in my mind, but even at this point, I want to welcome my team today. I want to ask Professor Okari to just reintroduce himself to our viewers, speak to us about where he's talking to us from.
So thank you so much, Chris, for having me again. And thanks to the panelists, Shadrach and Kefa. I'm Jeremiah Okari. I'm based here in Minneapolis. And I'm a teaching professor at the School of Graduate and Professional Programs here at St. Mary's University in Minnesota.
Professor Nasongo.
Hi, viewers. My name is Professor Wanjala Nasongo. I'm based in Memphis, Tennessee. I teach comparative politics at Rhodes College, but I'm currently on summer vacation, so I'm speaking from Madison, Wisconsin. Thank you.
Professor Tiso.
Yeah, hi viewers. My name is Professor Kefa Otiso. I teach at Bowling Green State University, mostly focusing on urban and economic geography and GIS. And I'm also serving as one of the commissioners on the Ohio New African Immigrants Commission. It's my pleasure to be here.
Like I said earlier, there's so much discussions going around in terms of the protests that were sparked off by the senseless killings of the Black community in America. This is a global issue. There's so much going on about what needs to happen. But today, I wanted us to focus mainly on the role that the African continent is supposed to play in all this, if there's any at all. I'm saying this because when during the heat of the moment, the country like Ghana came out quite openly and said that for the African diaspora, especially Africans in America, they have a home they can go back to. That was very touching on its own. Recently, I've been reading news that during an interview with President Uhuru Kenyatta, when he was asked about Black Lives Matter, he was what we'll call tone deaf. Instead of saying that Black Lives Matter like everybody else, at least a Black person, the Kenyan president said all lives matter. There's so much to debate about that. But before we go into that debate, I would like to just ask Professor Otiso to give us a background on why this discussion is long overdue in terms of the role that the African leaders back in Africa and the African diaspora can play in this debate that is going on.
Yes, let me start by mentioning that the issue of what Africa can do to help change conditions in the US actually in some ways goes back to the original creation of the African diaspora here in the United States, because as you know, the African Americans here that are actually originally from Africa. Now, obviously, the conditions under which they came were not favorable. Some can even argue that there were a number of African leaders at the time, in the 1400s to 1800s, that actually participated in the export of Africans as slaves to the New World. So we have been kind of included in this discussion, whether we like it or not, from that historical time frame. What is different now is that from the 1960s, when African countries began to agitate for independence, many of them actually having been led by people who actually came to the US early on to study at the behest of some African American initiatives, went back and actually started agitating for independence. But in the process, they were also helped by African Americans. Even Kenya is a perfect example, and Ghana is a perfect example. Then when they go back, as the civil rights movement is speaking steam in the US in the 1960s, we actually see a significant involvement of African states in that business. So let me give you a short story, and then we can proceed. When Ghana became independent, the State Department had to give its ambassador here in the US a pin that actually identified him as an ambassador, meaning that he was allowed to pretty much go everywhere in a segregated Washington, D.C. The issue is that once you give a black person, whether they are from Ghana, access to some of the segregated facilities of DC at the time, then it becomes difficult to deny the same privileges to African Americans. So even in that small example, you do see that the mere presence of an African ambassador, and later on many more from other African countries in a southern city, Washington, D.C., which was segregated at the time, actually helped to open doors for African Americans. And in turn, African Americans at the same time were actually helping African countries to craft, for example, their independence constitutions and those types of issues.
Professor Kari, build on that background.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's good that you mentioned Ghana, and Ghana is a major player in African political history. In part, and I think to Professor Otiso's point, I want to draw your attention to what happened in the 1920s. And during that time here in the United States, there was a thinking among scholars here, more specifically Marcus Garvey and William Frederick Du Bois, who were arguing on what was supposed to be done for the Africans here. So Marcus Garvey's argument was that there was a need for Africans to support Africans themselves. And Frederick William Du Bois, who was the first African-American holder who had a PhD from Harvard University, argued there was no need for Africans thinking of going back to Africa, which is what Garvey was arguing for. Sometime with their thinking, I think that dominated the thinking at that time in the US, and with Africans coming to the West, including Kwame Nkrumah of and many other leading Africans later into the 1940s and 1960s, which later saw the evolution of the likes of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, really dictated the thinking here about what the place of an African person was. And Ghana became a major player in that discussion. However, shortly after independence, I think the time Africa is becoming independent, late 1950s and then early 1960s, that's when you see a division of thinking among even African scholars, where I think about what should we do. And Kwame Nkrumah was at the forehead of agitating for Africa must unite. Unfortunately for Ghana, and I think still Ghana, we're mentioning Ghana because it really has, in my opinion, has an apology to make to the African. Because if indeed Africa was independent, or Ghana was as independent as should have been, and then Kwame Nkrumah's thinking should have spearheaded Africa to be more united, and hopefully we could not have the kind of divisions that we now have across Africa, and probably would be involved in much better discussion. fast forward to the 1990s, we also have the likes of our own Kenyan distinguished scholar, the late Professor Haile Mazrui, who argued for the recolonization theory, arguing that there was a need for Africans to be recognized again, and Professor Achi Mafeja from South Africa arguing that wasn't the need. So the discussion around this point is about what the place of the Black person should be. The argument that we should go back to the continental African geographically, yes, sounds sensational, but not realistic. I think what we should be talking about from that perspective is what is it that we, as Black people all across the world, should do so that united we move forward to make sure that we are comfortable, whether we are in Africa or here in West or whatever in Europe. I think that's the discussion that should be, particularly amongst the leaders, whether here in the West or across Africa.
Professor Nasongo, are we framing this discussion in the wrong way, that Africa as a continent and African leaders, plus the diasporas, have a role to play in what's going on around the world when it comes to the Black Lives Matter?
Yes, Africans both in the diaspora and on the continent have a huge role to play. And I will build on to what my colleagues have just mentioned. The role of the African diaspora, in fact, in the decolonization of the African continent was immense. During the 5th Pan-African Congress in 1945 in Manchester, it brought together quite a number of Africans from the continent. And this included Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, the Kamuzu Banda of Malawi, Peter Abrahams from South Africa. And this Congress was very crucial in the sense that it invoked African leaders from the continent to go back and put their hand on freedom's plow, to plow the ground for the seeds of liberty to grow. In fact, out of that, when Ghana became independent in 1957, Du Bois, that Professor Okari has mentioned, actually packed his bags and left and went to Ghana. He became President Nkrumah's chief advisor on African affairs. He became the editor of the Encyclopedia Africana. So the linkages between Africans in the diaspora and Africans on the continent is very huge. You did mention, Mr. Wamalwa, at the beginning that Ghana has made great strides, especially that they encourage the Africans in the diaspora who are willing to go and resettle in Ghana. In 2001, they actually passed a law, an immigration law that has come to be known as the right of abode. Any person of African descent has the right to go back to Ghana and settle. Last year was the so-called the year of return, marking the 400 years of slave trade, the beginning of slave trade. And 126 African Americans were actually accorded citizenship in Ghana in celebration of the so-called year of return. So these linkages are very important. And I get so disappointed that President Kenyatta is asked about what they should do about the African Lives Matter, and he says all lives matter. They do not matter at the same level. For example, I would have expected African leaders to seize this moment to argue the case against the nature of foreign aid that has been accorded African countries, because that nature of foreign aid has been exploitative. And so it is their duty then to seize this moment and argue for the reframing, for the rescheduling of the kind of aid and the economic relationships that exist between Africa and the countries of the West. So if they do not seize this moment to do these kinds of things, it becomes very disappointing. So they have a huge role to play in this.
Professor Tiso, I know you've been dealing with these issues of the diaspora. One of the problems that I'm having as an African parent, an African diaspora parent in the US, is how to define African diaspora and African American. My son is, for instance, is 21 years old. This guy, he's so passionate about what's going on right now that when we have a discussion at home, for him, for us saying that no, there's progress, we are seeing progress, because he tells me, you guys keep on saying that no, there's progress. We'll see change coming next time. But this is what the system has put in place. The question to you is, how are we supposed to define the diaspora, African diaspora, vis-a-vis African Americans, in view of the fact that we have our children growing up in America who identify more as African Americans than African Kenyans or African Nigerians or Liberians?
No. I think that's a difficult question and distinction in some ways, but there are many ways of skinning this particular cat, which is perhaps can be at the national level in terms of citizenship. So one can argue that if you're a citizen of the United States, then you're an African American. Now, but remember that diaspora to me is a bigger concept. It refers to any people group that are scattered across the globe, usually because of involuntary reasons. For example, remember the term comes from the Jewish diaspora that was created in AD 70 when the Roman Empire sacked Palestine, including the then Jewish state, and scattered Jews all over the globe. It was somewhat of an involuntary dispersal. Diasporas have this sense that they will finally return, and which in the case of the Jewish community did not happen until 1948. Yeah. So you can argue that a Kenyan diaspora at least has the notion within it of people who are likely to return to their original homeland, but that is not necessarily the case. Even Jews, not all of them have actually gone back. Some of them have ended up settling where they were scattered to, whether by design or by forces that were beyond their control. So we bring it back to the Kenyan case and even the African case. Yes, by virtue of birth, most countries, remember, confer citizenship based on birth. If you were born in the US, technically you're an African, you become an African American if your parents are from Africa. And remember, some of this is also has to do with how we are being racialized. You and I may not necessarily come in seeing ourselves as African Americans. We see ourselves as Kenyan immigrants. But when we get here, we get racialized into the major classes of race in the United States. So you have white, you have African American. Some people used to say it should be black, but there's a reason why they want to hark back to African American, because it ties them back to the continent of origin. So there is a point where your son is truly an African American because he was born here and he has citizenship here. But there's nothing wrong also including him in the Kenyan diaspora because his parents are from there. And quite frankly, it's getting to a point where in a global society, this distinction is increasingly becoming harder and harder to sustain, although we know that nations are still there. Countries have not died. So we still have passports that actually are coming from individual countries. We know that. But in terms of lived experiences and the real life, we are beginning to see people operating globally because the economy itself is global. And really, in some ways, I will urge those that have the opportunity of living in both worlds to take advantage of them as much as possible, because it's going to be very, very difficult to nail this distinction. And remember now, then what do you call, like Professor Nasongo was saying, some African Americans have returned to Ghana. So what do you call them in that particular case when they are in Ghana? Are they also part of the diaspora, or they are Ghanaians in that particular case, or they are Ghanaian Americans, because this thing can also work in reverse. So there's a lot you can say there, but I hope at least it has shed some light. I'm not trying to suggest that it's clear cut in more ways than one. If anything, globalization actually confuses the definition a lot, even though a lot of it perhaps should be understood at the nation state level.
I want to talk about more global citizenship, which is essential to your question. But when you look at the past experiences, I think you did mention in our private conversation about the Liberian experience, for example. The thinking back then was that if we take some of the slaves back to Africa, maybe then they'll be very comfortable in a land where their people will look and or sound like them. But I think from history, the experience has not been as positive as probably we'd anticipated. And then years later, talking about the Garveyism, Garvey argued so strongly the best way forward for the African people was to move back to Africa, and only in Africa could the African people be more comfortable. But that experience realistically didn't materialize. Years later, you talk about the Tomboya and the hair lift programs. What we're seeing during that time is not Africans being forced to the West, but it's Africans themselves choosing to come to the West. And so that's just a flat out reality. And then Professor Otizo and Nasongo also mentioned about modernization. We're not even talking about modernization, we're talking about post-modernization, where thanks to technology, the world today is very interconnected more than ever before. And the projections are that the world is going to be even more interconnected. So people are going to move around the world. They're going to settle any place around the world. And again, when you look at some of the major players in global history or politics, there's a disintegration of that. I think here in the United States, if you look at the economic growth, is not as fast as it was a few years ago. If you look at the African economies, there's a promise. Yes, there are problems, but there is a promise in Africa. If you look at Europe, quite frankly, it's disappointing to see countries such as the United Kingdom now, which was once called the Great Empire, disintegrating, and the European Union pretty much is not intact as was before. So there is a promise for Africans. Back to your question, what we should be talking about, whether they are Kenyans here, first generation or second generations, is a recognition that the world is changing as should. It's not going to stop, it's going to continue to change. And then we should also realize that for first generation immigrants, and Professor Otis is there, it's normal for first generation immigrants to experience this kind of problems, whether you want to identify yourself as a continental African, a conversation among academics and those ones who will argue we're Americans. If you talk about the Jews, there's that conversation about Jewism and being America. If you talk about Latin Americans, they too have the thinking of, I want to get attached to Latin America. You talk about the Chinese America, there's that attachment. But when you look at the newer generation, what I call the digital natives, the thinking is very different, and I think that's part of the frustration that we have among us, the first generation immigrants and our children. For immigrants, I think it's important to recognize the historical traumas that the African Americans went through to make sure that we're where we are, and then also recognize that although they are going through the traumas that they have, we too, our ancestors went through traumatic moments. The struggle for independence, it wasn't as easy as it was. There was a destruction of property. There was a destruction of human life that brought us to where we are. So key point is to engage in a conversation where we recognize all people, regardless of the color of their skin or accent, as equal human beings, whether the person is in the United States or is in Europe, whatever it is. The key point should be that we should be advocating for the Black person, young or old, to have a rightful place in the human history. That's fundamental. And to Professor Nasongo, I think you mentioned about the position taken by President Uhuru Kenyatta. Quite frankly, that's a very unfortunate statement to make, particularly when you know the emotions of the world. I focus on what an African person should be. That's quite frankly disappointing. What we should be doing right now across the continent of Africa, we should seize the moment, talk about how we should unite as a people, grow ourselves socially, economically, and politically. By so doing, only by so doing, can we then have a more advantage when we're going to talk about the geopolitical differences that we have in modern day society.
Professor Nasongo, we'll come back to the role that African leaders can play, but let's hang around this Uhuru statement, because like I mentioned, it sounded like what's in America they call tone deaf. That statement really wrangled so many people. Do you think it's his lack of understanding of what's going on around the emotions around African people around the world, or is it that he doesn't believe that there's a role that African leaders can play in this debate that is going on around the world?
Thank you very much, Chris. I think, first of all, it may be a lack of understanding, but it may be because of where he stands as well. The depredations that the Black person faces in countries like the United States and elsewhere in the so-called developed world are lived experiences by those individuals. But for people like Uhuru Kenyatta, these are things that do not register for them. So he may not fully understand the dynamics of oppression, the dynamics of exploitation, the dynamics of marginalization that people in the diaspora face. So hence the cavalier manner in which he responds to this. But then it should go to those who advise him then, those who provide advice to the president. How are they advising him in terms of seizing this strategic moment to make a difference in the lives of the people?
Professor Tiso, please just comment on Uhuru's statement, because for some reasons, it's really wrangled so many people. Again, just like I asked the two professors, is where is the origin of this tone deaf kind of response to a very sensitive, a very emotional issue and question like Black Lives Matter that is completely changing the world as we understand it?
No, I think if I can add to what Professor Nasongo just said, it could be that he did not know, but I'd like to add another dimension to it, which is that, you know, all truth is parallel. What you see happening in the US has parallels in other parts of the globe. So if Uhuru is thinking like a Kenyan politician, I would guess that he knows that if he says Black Lives Matter, then that actually can be used against him internally, because remember, there are also systems of hegemony and oppression within Kenya itself. So there's this ethnic hierarchy that we have been talking about, the understanding in Kenya that some groups are more important than others, which is actually how we ended up in the 2007-8 political crisis, which eventually led to the new constitution that, by the way, is trying to address some of the historical injustices within Kenya itself. So part of it is actually, I think also that Uhuru knows where he stands. So President Uhuru knows where he stands. He knows that when he starts talking of Black Lives Matter, that actually has direct parallels, for example, to the place of ethnic minorities in Kenya. And that might actually introduce some uncomfortable political realities for him. So, but he knows that if he says all lives matter, then in the application of that in Kenya is that every ethnic community matters, which then does not open the can of worms that I've just mentioned.
Viewers, I've been speaking to very smart people that have made me look very smart. This is a group that I turn to when I'm dealing with many questions in my mind when it comes to African diaspora and issues that affect the diaspora. Today, we've been discussing Black Lives Matter and how, whether if there's a role that African continent as it is, but more specifically African leaders can play in playing a part in this once in a generation movement that is happening. Changes are happening all around us. You know, old colonial legacies are being broken, and for quite some time we've realized that there's, apart from Ghana, there's very little coming out of the African continent. Most of these people have their origin in Africa, and so that's the reason why we've convened this meeting. I want to thank my panel today, Professor Kari, Professor Wanjala Nasongo, Professor Kefo Tiso. These are people that I'll keep on turning to as we make sense of this confusion that is going on around Black Lives Matter. And this is just one in a series of discussions that we're going to have, because this is very important. As the diaspora, African diaspora in America, living at this time, at this period, these are very, very important discussions. And as our main professors like Professor Maizurui, Professor Ngugi, Fedov, these are going to be our voices who understand history around Africa and African issues. Thank you very much. I hope to see you again next week. This has been the Diaspora Live Show. Next week, we are going to bring back our webinars around investments and business. But for now, I want to thank my panel for making me look smart and making you, my viewer, also understand some of these issues. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Okay.